In last week's session, we focused on the problem of global inequalities. This week, we turn our gaze to an intimately connected issue, the problem of borders. I will again address two main questions in relation to a host of core readings on the topic. This time, the two questions are: one, are border walls and fences but a last vestige of a dying system of territorially bounded sovereignty? And two, how useful is the concept of border imperialism? The core readings which we will review in order to bring these questions into focus include chapters from Wendy Brown's Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, Rhys Jones's Violent Borders, Refugees and the Right to Move, and Harsha Walia's Undoing Border Imperialism. We will also integrate into our discussion important arguments that can be found in Etienne Balibar's article on Europe as Borderland, Walter Mignolo and Madina Klostanova's article on Theorizing from the Borders, as well as a collaborative interdisciplinary intervention on the state of sovereignty at the border. Finally, we will also incorporate insights from the work of Achille Mbembe on borders as bodies and on the idea of a borderless world, and from Sandro Mazzadra and Brett Nielsen's important book, Border as Method. And what is a border? Let us begin with a matter of definition. To be able to frame borders as a global social problem, of course, requires that we can understand that to which we are referring when we mention the word borders. However, there are many kinds of borders, some material and physical, others conceptual or epistemological. What's more, as Etienne Balibar would emphasize in a rightly influential essay published in 2002 with the title, What is a Border? There are particular difficulties inherent in providing a concrete and concise definition of the concept of the border. Indeed, according to Balibar, the idea of a simple definition of what constitutes a border is by definition absurd. This is because, he argues, to mark out a border is precisely to define a territory, to delimit it, and so to register the identity of that territory or confer one upon it. And yet, conversely, to define or identify in general is nothing other than to trace a border, to assign boundaries or borders, which poses a clear danger for any theorist who attempts to define what a border is, namely the danger of going round in circles, since the very representation of the border is the precondition for any definition. In the same essay, Balibar also highlights the polysemy and heterogeneity of borders, while nevertheless noting that their multiplicity, their hypothetical and fictive nature, does not make them any less real. For Balibar, not only are there different kinds of borders that individuals belonging to different social groups experience in different ways, but borders also simultaneously perform several functions of demarcation and territorialization between distinct social exchanges or flows, between distinct rights, and so forth. Moreover, as Massadra and Nielsen have seconded, borders are always overdetermined, meaning that no political border is ever the mere boundary between two states, but is always sanctioned, reduplicated, and relativized by other geopolitical divisions. Without the world configuring function they perform, Balibar writes, there would be no borders, no lasting borders. In his 1950 classic Nomos of the Earth, The Nomos of the Earth, the controversial but profound German jurist and philosopher Carl Schmitt had insisted that, quote, every new age and every new epoch in the coexistence of peoples, empires, and countries, of rulers and power formations of every sort, is founded on new spatial divisions, new enclosures, and new spatial orders of the earth. Balibar's argument is certainly reminiscent of Schmitt's, for Schmitt had maintained that the tracing of borders within modern Europe went hand in hand with political and legal arrangements that were designed to organize an already global space. These arrangements, including different kinds of global lines and geographical divisions, provided a blueprint for the colonial partitioning of the world and the regulation of relations between Europe and its outsides. To put it briefly, the articulation between these global lines of colonial and imperialist expansion and the drawing of linear boundaries between European and Western states has constituted for several centuries the dominant motif of the global geography organized by capital and state. More recently, in his essay on Europe as Borderland, Balibar has elaborated along more or less expressly Schmittian lines that every border has a double meaning, local and global. It is a line, more or less accepted, stable, permeable, visible, thick or thin, separating territories which, by virtue of its drawing, become foreign. And it is a partition or distribution of the world's space, which reflects the regime of meaning and power under which the world is represented as a unity of different parts. In the same article, Balibar carefully sketches four conflicting patterns of world political spaces, relating each to different representations of European borders, in particular, these being a clash of civilizations pattern, a global network pattern, a center periphery pattern, and finally, a crossover pattern corresponding to a representation of Europe as a borderland. But perhaps we get ahead of ourselves. If borders are always imagined within and at the same time help to configure what Schmitt conceptualized as world space, they also always have a more local meaning and function. For clearly, as Balibar also insists, the question of borders turns out to be central when we reflect about citizenship and more generally about political association. The birth or invention of the border is one of the constitutive components of the emergent Eurocentric model of the modern nation state. In Balibar's words, quote, "It is indeed a commonplace among historians and probably also geographers that the constitution of the modern nation state, through the invention of borders, which replaced the ancient forms of marches or limes, combining on the same line administrative, juridical, fiscal, military, even linguistic functions, was in particular a transformation of the more or less indefinite heterogeneous space into territories controlled by a monopolistic state power, thus rendered homogeneous. This could be called generally a process of the territorialization of space, which forms a precondition for the emergence of politics as such in the modern sense. The territorialization of space, understood as a precondition for the emergence of political modernity or of modern conceptions of political life, is captured nicely as well by Benedict Anderson at the outset of his extremely influential account of nationalism, Imagined Communities, where he distinguishes such modern conceptions of political life from presumably pre-modern conceptions associated with the dynastic realm. According to Anderson, quote, "Kingship organizes everything around a high center. Its legitimacy derives from divinity, not from populations, who, after all, are subjects, not citizens. In the modern conception, state sovereignty is fully, flatly, and evenly operative over each square centimeter of a legally demarcated territory. But in the older imagining, where states were defined by centers, borders were porous and indistinct, and sovereignties faded imperceptibly into one another. Hence, paradoxically enough, the ease with which pre-modern empires and kingdoms were able to sustain their rule over immensely heterogeneous and often not even contiguous populations for long periods of time." Borders and sovereignty. And so we come to the word sovereignty. The concepts of the border and of sovereignty are closely connected. As Peter Solons has persuasively put the point, though he uses the term boundaries, quote, "Modern definitions of territorial sovereignty focus on political boundaries as the point at which a state's territorial competence finds its ultimate expression. States are defined by their exclusive jurisdiction over delimited territory, and the boundaries of territorial competence define the sovereignty of a state. A recognized authority on international law, Charles de Vicher, wrote that the firm configuration of its territory furnishes the state with the recognized setting for the exercise of its sovereign powers. The relative stability of this territory is a function of the exclusive authority of that state that the state exercises within it, and the coexistence beyond its boundaries of political entities endowed with similar prerogatives. It is because the state is a territorial organization that the violation of its boundaries is inseparable from the idea of aggression against the state itself." To return to Balibar once again, we can say with him that territories are not only associated with the invention of the border, but are also inseparable from the institution of power as sovereignty. More precisely, they combine in a single unity the institutions of absolute sovereignty, the border, and the government of populations. Border lines which allow a clear distinction between the national, domestic, and the foreigner express sovereignty as a power to attach populations to territories in a stable or regulated manner, to administrate the territory through the control of the population, and conversely, to govern the population through the division and the survey of the territory. Moreover, as Balibar continues, quote, this is especially clear in early classical thinkers of the absolute monarchy, such as Bodin, who defines the national citizen as combining private freedom and public subjection on a given territory, a free franchise subject under the rule of a sovereign. The most important marks of sovereignty, a terminology also used by Hobbes, concern the use of borders to secure the fiscal administration of the territory and the settlement of religious conflicts among the population through the preeminence of the state's authority within the national borders. The state then becomes the representative of the people, or the common interests of the people, against its sectarian interests or the interests of specific subgroups on its territory. Furthermore, as the sovereignty of the absolute monarch becomes replaced by the sovereignty of the absolute people, or its abstract incarnation, the democratic state, this structure of appropriation becomes able to work in both directions. The citizens belong to the state, which in turn is their property or belongs to them in an exclusive manner. As such, according to Balibar, the absolutization and sacralization of borders is perhaps even greater in the democratic state than in the monarchic state, which invented it, precisely because it expresses now the fact that the state is ideally the people's property, just as it is the eminent representative owner of the population's rights. In a word, the invention of borders cannot be dissociated from the emergence of the doctrine of sovereignty. Now, towards the outset of her decisive 2010 intervention in her book, Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, Wendy Brown skillfully sketches a composite figure of sovereignty drawn from classical theorists of modern sovereignty, including Thomas Hobbes, Jean Bodin, and Carl Schmitt, and proceeds to suggest that sovereignty's indispensable features include supremacy, no higher law, perpetuity over time, no term limits, decisionism, no boundedness by or submission to law, absoluteness and completeness, sovereignty cannot be probable or partial, non-transferability, sovereignty cannot be conferred without canceling itself, and specified jurisdiction, territoriality. She further continues, if nation-state sovereignty has always been something of a fiction in its aspiration and claim to these qualities, the fiction is a potent one and has suffused the internal and external relations of nation-states since its consecration in the 1648 Peace of Westphalia. But now, signs are proliferating to the effect that we are more and more coming to inhabit a post-Westphalian world. Along such lines, Balibar has emphasized that the absolutized and sacralized status of borders has been relativized in the history of the 20th century, already before the official advent of globalization, especially in the case of the European territories, both in the form of the emergence of supranational superborders and in the form of a progressive dismantling of the multiple administrative functions of the national borders, some being steadily reinforced, particularly the police function, controlling the flows of immigrants, etc., others being weakened and separated from the borderline, for example, the monetary independence or the fiscal control. The recent transformations in the status and function of borders and the relation of such transformations to the much discussed crisis of sovereignty of the nation state is the focus of Wendy Brown's book. Brown contends that over the past half century, the monopoly of the combined attributes of sovereignty by nation states has been severely compromised by growing transnational flows of capital, people, ideas, goods, violence, and political and religious fealty. These flows, she continues, both tear at the borders they cross and crystallize as powers within them, thus compromising sovereignty from its edges, compromising sovereignty from its edges and from its interior. Nor are these the only trends at work to compromise sovereignty. According to Brown, nation-state sovereignty has been undercut as well by neoliberal rationality, which recognizes no sovereign apart from entrepreneurial decision makers, large and small, which displaces legal and political principles, especially liberal commitments to universal inclusion, equality, liberty, and the rule of law, with market criteria, and which demotes the political sovereign to managerial status. Nation-state sovereignty has also been eroded by the steady growth and importance of international economic and governance institutions such as the IMF and the WTO. And nation-state sovereignty has been challenged by a quarter century of post-national and international assertions of law, rights, and authority that sometimes openly aim to subvert or supersede the sovereignty of states. In a word, for Brown, the walls and fences proliferating at borders around the world are best interpreted not as a sign of strength and state power, but a last vestige of a dying system of territorially bounded sovereignty. Along similar lines, the Cameroonian philosopher and leading post-colonial theorist, Achille Mbembe, has even spoken of the emergence by the early 21st century of corporate sovereignty, which he considers an unprecedented form of power whose main aspiration is to free itself from democratic oversight. Indeed, Mbembe warns that as a result, we might no longer live in an epoch when sovereignty was exercised by the demos. The demos, properly understood, might no longer be the sovereign. Finance capital in the guise of a ubiquitous digital architecture might have definitely become the new Leviathan. We are witnessing the historical bifurcation between liberal democracy and finance capitalism, and the emergence of a new form of sovereignty, corporate sovereignty, which claims for itself the law of immunity and the powers of exception. In a word, for Mbembe, the globalization of corporate sovereignty, the extension of capital into every sphere of life, and technological escalation in the form of the computational are all part of one and the same process. For her part, Brown emphasizes that globalization, or what we have come to call a global world, comes with dialectical tensions. More specifically, it harbors fundamental tensions between opening and barricading, fusion and partition, erasure and reinscription. These tensions materialize as increasingly liberalized borders on the one hand, and the development of unprecedented funds, energies, and technologies to border fortification on the other. Emblematic of, indeed crystallizing these tensions, is the proliferation of new walls striating the globe. Such proliferation, Brown emphasizes, is paradoxical given that the most potent forms of power and violence today are uncontainable by physical walling. Indeed, Brown articulates what she considers to be three paradoxes inherent in this phenomenon of proliferating border walls. One featuring simultaneous opening and blocking, one featuring universalization combined with exclusion and stratification, and one featuring networked and virtual power met by physical barricades. Brown contends that one striking fact about these new barriers is that they are not built as defenses against invading armies, or even as shields against weapons launched in the interstate wars. Rather, they target non-state transnational actors. Brown situates her account of the contours of the crisis of nation-state sovereignty by contrasting it, on the one hand, with Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's claim that nation-state sovereignty is transformed into global empire, and on the other, with Giorgio Agamben's claim that sovereignty is metamorphosed into the worldwide production and sacrifice of bare life, or global civil war. She argues instead that key characteristics of sovereignty are migrating from the nation state to the unrelieved domination of capital and God-sanctioned political violence. Which brings us to the crux of her argument about the proliferation of border walls. Brown insists that counterintuitively, perhaps, it is the weakening of state sovereignty, and more precisely, the detachment of sovereignty from the nation state, that is generating much of the frenzy of nation state wall building today. Rather than resurgent expressions of nation-state sovereignty, the new walls are icons of its erosions. These icons of the erosion of nation-state sovereignty are certainly not bereft of irony. One such irony associated with proliferation, Brown points out, is that they end up blurring the very distinction between inside and outside that their construction is intended to perform, to mark, and to enforce. In her words, a structure taken to mark and enforce an inside-outside distinction, a boundary between us and them, and between friend and enemy, appears as precisely the opposite when grasped as part of a complex of eroding lines between the police and the military, subject and patria, vigilante and state, law and lawlessness. Brown emphasizes the theatrical, the performative, even the spectacular function of these walls. She argues that the new walls project an image of sovereign jurisdictional power and an aura of the bounded and secure nation that are at the same time undercut by their existence and also by their functional inefficacy. And so they function theatrically. projecting power and efficaciousness that they do not and cannot actually exercise, and that they also performatively contradict. Brown goes further still to stress the way in which this performative contradiction, this theatricalized and spectacularized performance of sovereign power, serves to bring into relief what she calls the theological remainder of nation-state sovereignty. In a word, the walls stage an aura of sovereign power and are thus intended to induce a sense of awe. Brown introduces a psychoanalytic component into her argument here to suggest that the walls respond in part to psychic fantasies, anxieties, and wishes, indeed that they are capable of producing psychic containment, even if they are not effective at doing what they purport to do. In other words, walls generate what Heidegger terms a reassuring world picture in a time increasingly lacking the horizons, containment, and security that humans have historically required for social and psychic integration and for political membership. Though the walls are thus performative and spectacular and respond to psychic fantasies, their consequences are very real. Indeed, they are part and parcel of the surge of reactionary nationalism across much of the globe. This because walls built around political entities cannot block out without shutting in, cannot secure without making securitization a way of life, cannot define an external they without producing a reactionary we, even as they also undermine the basis of that distinction. Psychically, socially, and politically, walls inevitably convert a protected way of life into hunkering and huddling. In sum, Brown argues that the proliferation of border walls are best interpreted as a political theatrical response to eroding nation-state sovereignty. Barriers like those at the US-Mexico, India-Pakistan, or South Africa-Zimbabwe borders are generally ineffective in blocking what they formerly aim to interdict. However, contemporary border walls function as symbolic and semiotic responses to crises produced by eroded sovereign state capacities to secure territory, citizens, and economies against growing transnational flows of power, people, capital, religions, ideas, or terror. Indeed, Brown goes further still to insist that walls do not merely index but accelerate waning state sovereignty. They blur the policing and military functions of states and also generate new vigilantism at the border. They increase organized criminal operations and expand their transnational links for smuggling humans, drugs, weapons, and other contraband across borders. And they intensify nationalist sentiments that in turn spur demands for greater exercise of state sovereignty, more effective walling, and less flexibility in responding to globalization's vicissitudes and volatilities. In all of these ways, the new borders fortifications tend to deepen the crises of sovereignty to which they also respond. Far from mere palliatives or props for degraded sovereign power, they are a kind of pharmacon, worsening the problem they respond to, even as they throw a sop to constituencies anxious or angry at states' declining capacities to uphold social contracts, to secure order, prosperity, and protection. With that, I think we will take a break.